Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us. My name is Minahil. I am a member of SALAM, South Asian Left. We're here tonight as part of the Tata Bye Bye campaign. And we're really, really excited to welcome Rhys Machold and Azad Essa for this book talk on fabricating Homeland Security. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. You all know from being lined up for it that there's samosas in the back, samosas and chai. The samosas are vegetarian. The chai, I believe, has dairy milk. Yeah. And this event is being live streamed. It's really going to be focused just up here. But if you do have any issues with, being on camera, just a note to maybe not pass in the front and to instead go around the back. Thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop for having us here. And not only did they host us, they were just like, here's the keys. Let yourself in and go off, which was really huge next step in our relationship. And yeah, we are super grateful to be here in this space. There is space in the back if anyone needs to, take a breather or you need to pray. There's a janamaz on the chair right when you enter. And then lastly, bathrooms. There are two gender neutral bathrooms. There's one right here, and then one through the kitchen. And in addition to obviously the chai and samosas, if you need water, there is a tap in the kitchen, and the cups are on the table over there too. You're also welcome to use the mugs for water as well. And I'm gonna pass it. I'm gonna be your MC tonight, so you'll be seeing me back up here, and here's my face. But that's the only time you'll see it, unless I'm eating. And yeah, thank you all for masking and making this a COVID-safe space. We also have an air purifier going. And I'm gonna pass it to my comrade Mansi, who's gonna, do some grounding for us about this current moment in the political situation in Palestine, and talk to us about the campaign too. Yay, Mansi! Woo.
Hey everyone, I'm Mansi. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So I'm here to do a little bit of, as Minahil said, a little bit of grounding in the political moment. But as I was trying to write this, I think I realized that every day it becomes harder and harder to really try to comprehend, to try to encapsulate the horrors that we're seeing. Just new and unconscionable horrors unleashed every single day by the Zionists against the Palestinian people. And it, often feels as though there's very little left to say. But I do want to ground us in why we're here and why it's our duty, why it's our obligation to continue to be here. Here in the US, as the genocide wages on, and not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank, across Palestine, as US-Israeli bombs continue to drop on Lebanon, on Syria, on Yemen, it is our duty to continue to escalate for Palestine. We must remain unwavering in our solidarity for the Palestinian people and steadfast in support of their resistance to the occupation and their continued struggle for liberation. Even amidst increased state repression here, we must continue to remind ourselves every day that we cannot be silenced. The repression of solidarity for Palestine now will tomorrow be weaponized against any expression of dissent in this blood-soaked imperialist state. And so we must remain steadfast, and we must continue to envision a future in which Palestine is free. So just to get some energy going in this room, let's chant a little. Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free, free Palestine.
Free, free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free, free Palestine.
Free, free, free Palestine.
Our only course of action.
Our only course of action.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Our only course of action.
Our only course of action.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.
All right, thanks everyone. So I'm just gonna lead us into talking about how we're trying to take action on exactly that, right? Boycott, divestment, sanctions. So in October, we as SALAM launched a campaign against Tata, which is a multinational Indian conglomerate with its hands everywhere. Tata supplies weapons for the Zionist entity, maintains cloud computing infrastructure, banking services for the settlements, and supplies vehicles, armored vehicles that patrol stolen land. It's a behemoth that is synonymous with Indian capital itself. And so we see it as really a prime example of private capital, and particularly Indian capital's complicity and participation in occupation and genocide. So I want to give us, sorry, next slide. Our campaign is targeting Tata, and our main goal here is really to eventually get Tata to boycott the Zionist entity. Of course, in order to do that, we're trying to exert pressure through the partners here. We launched in October, and our goal is to try to demand that New York Roadrunners drop Tata Consultancy Services, or TCS, from the marathon. We're in coalition with many organizations, some of whom are here today. And we hope to, in the next year, really deepen and expand our research, again, in collaboration with other groups, including Little Sis, notably, and to deepen and expand our coalition work, which I hope that many of you here and your organizations will join, and to really ramp up our pressure on groups that are partnered with Tata, with TCS, to get them to drop Tata and TCS and boycott from the Zionist entity. So briefly, I want to explain why is it important that we, at this moment, why is it important that we target Indian capital, right? For that, I'm going to give you just a very brief history. And I know that Azad and Rhys are going to expand on that. But for many decades, India has been collaborating with the Zionist entity behind, for years, lip service to solidarity with Palestine. As the global economy began to expand in the 80s, India really turned to so-called Israel as a conduit to build closer ties to the United States. And since then, in the last few decades, as India has continued to liberalize its economy, get closer to the US, ramp up its violent occupations and wars against resistant groups in Kashmir, in central and northeast India, it's drawn increasingly closer to the US and to Israel, in defense, in intelligence, and business. Since 2014, India has been the single largest purchaser of Israeli weapons on the planet and is now exporting workers. So now what we're seeing, our analysis is that with growing dissent here, as the Zionist entity is really turning to new markets to manufacture and purchase arms, especially ones with cheaper labor, India can very quickly grow in importance. As again, and the Indian government right now, alongside key mega corporations, have really capitalized on these new opportunities within the industry of death. And India's arms exports have risen exponentially at a rate of 30 times in the last 10 years alone. Indian corporations have collectively invested billions of dollars in the Zionist entities' architecture of occupation and genocide. And the US is a key broker in this relationship. So that's why we here, we must intervene in this relationship, and we must fight to break those ties. We must fight against Indian capital, and that's why we're here today. So I want to pass it back to Machold briefly to introduce our speakers today. But before I do that, I just wanted to say quickly that we want this conversation to be a way for all of us to better understand this relationship, a way for us to understand why we're here, what we can do from here, how we can intervene, how this campaign can be more effective, how we can be more effective in our fight. So this is not meant to be, and just want to remind all of us here, this is not meant to be an academic exercise, and this is not meant to be something that you come here for an event and go without. We want us all to take action together, and we want to continue to build out the work that is necessary. That is our duty. So, free Palestine.
Woo. Thanks so much, Monsi, for really, bringing us into why this work is so important and what's going on right now, and how we can all build together to challenge these systems of genocidal systems of oppression. So I'm really, really excited to be able to welcome Rhys and Azad tonight. You can see their bios up here, but I'm going to read them for you too. So Rhys Machold is a scholar of policing, security regimes, racialization, and empire, working from a transnational approach. His work has focused primarily on India and Palestine, Israel, and relations between them. He has just published his new book, Fabricating Homeland Security, Police Entanglements Across India and Palestine, Israel, Stanford University Press, which traces the political fallout of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, often known as India's 9/11, or simply 26/11. Concentrating on the efforts of Israel's Homeland Security to advise and equip Indian city and state governments. Rhys is a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow in the School of Social and Political Sciences. He's also currently an editor at Critical Studies on Security and an editorial board member at International Studies Review. Welcome, Rhys. And Rhys is going to be in conversation with Azad Essa, a regular SALAM community member who we've been happy to be in conversation with here in this space before. Azad Essa is a senior reporter for Middle East Eye based in the New York metropolitan area. His reporting and commentary range from US foreign policy and its impact on Muslim and Arab communities to India and Hindu nationalism. He previously worked for Al Jazeera English between 2010 to 2018, covering Southern and Central Africa for the network. He is the author of Hostile Homeland, The New Alliance Between India and Israel, published by Pluto Press. Thank you so much. Rhys and Azad, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming this evening for this discussion. Thank you for SALAM for organizing this event. Rhys, thank you for coming all the way from, which is it, Scotland or Canada?
Today, Canada.
All right. So, before we start the conversation, I'd also like to talk a little bit about what's happening right now as well. We meet tonight under the most grotesque of circumstances. Whereas the latest iteration of the genocide began on October 7th, in more than 50,000 Palestinians, conservatively speaking, have been killed since then. The current onslaught that we are seeing now, has reached new levels of depravity. And the scenes out of Gaza are simply horrifying. Some of you would be aware that, the level of devastation is largely incomprehensible at this point. It's a demolition job. And the inability to put a halt to this carnage is not merely an indictment, of our so-called world order and the institutions that we are supposed to be respecting, but it's also an indictment on our collective sort of failure to dismantle the institutions and the bodies and the structures that have paved the way to the genocide. It's also an illustration of the extent to which of military might and not values of democracy or justice that rule our lives. And as people have previously warned, when it comes to settler colonialism and genocide, Gaza is not the first, and neither will it be the last. And so it goes without saying how urgent this moment it really is for direct actions, for education, for advocacy, about how Israel and Zionism is really all around us, forever hovering and watching, and now a part of our daily lives. And truly, none of us are safe. And so today's discussion speaks directly to this phenomenon. And I don't want to overstate the importance of book talks and events. But this one today speaks to the current and even to our future. Rhys Machold's new book, Fabricating Homeland Security, is about Indian and Israeli police working together. But what it's really about is the sham and the scam of the concept of homeland security. It's an incredibly detailed study of how these two countries, already growing closer together on account of their shared anti-Muslim bigotry, took on new collaborations in the aftermath of an attack in Mumbai in 2008, in what was, what became known as India's 9/11. 166 people or so were killed during that attack, including several Israelis. Now, with Indians looking for answers as to what happened, Israelis entered and spoke about their solutions, the type that they used on Palestinians. And so Indian police in Maharashtra, the state where Mumbai belongs to, began importing these tactics to so-called protect the homeland. So I'm, of course, summarizing and paraphrasing, but consider the absurdity of these developments. India, which supports Palestinian statehood, takes weapons and tactics from Israel that uses those weapons against the same Palestinians in the name of protecting internal security or their homeland security. It's completely absurd. So in other words, Machold's book shows how a bunch of transnational incidents and processes intersect to produce a type of technology that helps the ruling classes and elites impose racial governance or laws and policies of segregation and apartheid. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. So it's not incidental that India has turned into an ethno-nationalist state with the help of Israel. It's not incidental that the tactics of the police in Israel, in the US, in India, all resemble each other. And Machold's book helps us draw those links and helps us imagine what might be next. So, before we start this conversation, I'd like to emphasize to you all to please try to get a copy of the book, read it, share it, discuss it. There's a lot in it that should not be ignored. So, welcome, Rhys. I'm very happy that you are here. And we have a round of applause for Rhys for joining us. So I want to start with an obvious sort of icebreaker, right? What's your story? As in, why did you write this book? When did you start it? How did this all happen? And if you want to talk about the behind you as well, go ahead.
Thanks so much, and thanks for SALAM for organizing. I should also just say before we get into it, about a year before my book came out, Azad's book came out with a dangerously similar title to mine, which they gave me a heart attack because I sincerely wondered if he accidentally written the same book before mine came out. Fortunately, I think they cover slightly different ground, but his work has always been a massive inspiration. I draw on it extensively in the book, and it's just, I really, in many ways, couldn't have done it without you. And we were talking about the poster before this event took place, or before we came here tonight. And I will say, when Aman shared it with me, I was gleeful and very excited about it. I've since started to wonder a little bit about whether it is good for my future. If you Google me now, it's one of the first things that pops up. But anyway, I guess I'm stuck with it one way or the other. But it's really beautiful, and I think it speaks to a lot of the things that I've been thinking about for a long time. So in relation to your question, I think it's always funny when you write these things, books like this that took me a very long time, more than a decade. It is funny to think back how they actually started. And I think for me, the thing that sort of started this is sort of what you were saying about sort of the resemblances of policing across different jurisdictions. And one of the things initially that was sort of on my mind as I began to think of this as a key was these mega events of the 20 that I was attending, like Toronto and so on, where you seem to have kind of shared tactics, things like the police kettle, for example, whereby protesters were being sort of contained in this seemingly parallel way. But as I began to sort of look more into the literature on police power, what became increasingly clear is that policing, despite its domestic associations, ultimately is something that functions in many ways across jurisdictions and is not in any way sort of contained in the domestic environments that we associate with it. And so in particular, I was interested in sort of also pushing the boundaries geographically beyond the areas that have received the most attention, namely the United States and the UK, into places that are much less explored. And India, despite being a massive country of enormous political and geopolitical importance, a shockingly, surprisingly little amount of critical research has been done on this. So
That's Homeland Security. A large chunk of your book focuses on Homeland Security. Do you want to, this is really important given that there's all these agents now knocking on people's doors, right, in the US. Do you want to define Homeland Security for us? And where does it come from, the term? And if you want to also add into your answer, a little bit about anything else about your book or the argument in your book that I may have missed in my introduction.
Sure. I think also, for an American audience, particularly here, I think it's worth noting that the term Homeland Security does originate in the War on Terror. It was founded by the inauguration of the Department of Homeland Security in late 2002. So prior to that moment, the term Homeland Security did not exist as such. However, the word homeland, it's also worth saying, though, although Homeland Security is often associated with being a quintessentially American construction of the War on Terror, it was the word homeland was not a way that most Americans thought about the domestic space prior to 9/11. And some of the early work that was done on that by historians like Amy Kaplan, for example, immediately recognized where the resonance of homeland was much more dense and apparent, and particularly in the Zionist project as well as South Africa. And in those contexts, homeland was very much something that was resonant in terms of pacifying indigenous people and dispossessing them of their land. And so I think basically it's important to sort of highlight that Homeland Security in some ways is very American, but the resonance it has gained as a kind of pacification program, I think arguably comes from a much longer history of empire and dispossession, and Zionism and South Africa are two of the places where that really originates etymologically, but also ideologically. And I think we can think about it both. I think, it connotes a kind of domestic protection of the domestic space. But one of the key arguments of the books is that that is both true in some senses, but also misleading in the sense that its remit has always been transnational and has never been contained within any given state. And it really can't function in any sort of hermetically sealed domestic space, and always relies on transnational connections, both ideologically, but also materially. And I think we see this now in the present moment where it's like no police agency really works purely in the place where it ostensibly is located.
So if we are talking about Homeland Security being beyond an actual physical space, right, especially a border, who is it protecting?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the central themes of the book, and I think we see this now in the present moment clearly, is we should not take security regimes in general at their word in terms of protecting people from really anything, despite their pretenses to public safety. Security historically has never really been that. Karl Marx observed in the Jewish Question a long time ago that security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society, and I think that's now true as much now as ever. That being said, the threats that Homeland Security ostensibly seeks to contain themselves are real. For example, in a place like Bombay and now Mumbai, it's not like the threats to ordinary people are somehow made up. They are profound and they are ordinary. The thing is that the security regimes that are instantiated to ostensibly protect ordinary people typically don't do the work of public safety, but instead do the work of pacification, i.e., of suppressing people, of protecting property, of preventing people from realizing their full potential. So I think it's important to take seriously that the threats and risks that are in the world are real, but the way in which security regimes themselves operate typically don't do almost anything for ordinary people to make their lives safer or better or more possible to realize their potential.
So these events take place in 2008, these attacks. What happens after that? Paint us a picture about how the Israelis got involved with intervening in that space in terms of bringing those tactics to Mumbai.
Right. So when I first started out this book many years ago, my impression was that their interventions into Mumbai and the state of Maharashtra sort of came after the event itself. But when I did a bit of digging into the archive of news coverage of the event, what I found was something rather quite peculiar and striking, which was the fact that Israeli actors got involved in the event before it was even over, in the sense that because a number of Israelis and Jews were attacked during the attacks, particularly at one location called Chabad House or Nerman House in Mumbai, basically the figures of the Israeli state, like Ehud Barak at the time, and others immediately got on TV to kind of lambaste the Indian authorities as incompetent and unable to protect Jewish life. And so I think this tells us a lot, both about that event itself and how it took place, but a broader story of just the sheer extent to which the Zionist project will go to kind of name and shame other places and compel them to adopt so-called Israeli security solutions. And since October 7th, I think one thing that's really striking is this organization, Zaka, that some of you may have heard of, that was one of the major arbiters of trying to produce this myth that October 7th involved mass rapes of Israelis. That same organization was on the ground during 26/11 in Mumbai and responsible for extracting Jewish and Israeli bodies and preventing Indian authorities from doing autopsies on them. They extracted them out of the attack before it was even over and essentially blamed Indian forces for having killed them without any evidence at all. And so that created a profound firestorm and major geopolitical controversies that made the Indian state look weak and incompetent, but also basically complicit in not protecting Jews. And so the book sort of excavates that long forgotten story of how they actually got involved, which was much more, I guess, nefarious than I would have anticipated.
So your book looks, your book is a bit unique in that it involves the U.S., India, Israel relationship and the adoption of Homeland Security methods. But it also, you have access to some of these officials, like Israeli security consultants and Indian police officials at the time who, either pushed back against getting those weapons or were part of the decision making. How did you access those characters, firstly? And secondly, what did you learn from them? And what I mean by this is, what are the debates that they were having about adopting these tactics, and how they spoke about each other behind closed doors? Could you give us some sense about that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the book involved, basically speaking, to two main sets of actors. The first one were Israeli Homeland Security specialists, experts, police trainers, weapons dealers, and so on. And that involved going to Palestine to find them in their offices and various sort of corporate events to speak with them directly. And the second group of actors was primarily, Indian cops and government officials in the state of Maharashtra and the city of Mumbai. And I traced basically how they interacted from their own reflections of those experiences. I think from the Israeli perspective, what they were primarily interested in is extracting profit and using this event of 26/11 as a way into, in their words, penetrating India, i.e. getting more access to what they imagined to be an exploding market opportunity for them to extract more profits and sell more things. But one thing that really sort of shocked me is what they said about each other behind closed doors. And despite, Azad's book really details the ideological sort of contours of the Israel-India relationship and sort of, to some extent, what's said in public, but what they said about each other behind closed doors was often very different. The Israelis were surprisingly, overtly, extremely racist, and they clearly did not see their Indian counterparts as their equals. They treated them with enormous contempt and disrespect. They disparaged them as effeminate and weak and pathetic. And they clearly didn't appreciate that the Indian officials didn't indulge them as the kinds of experts that they thought they were. And conversely, the Indian cops that I talked to, although they in many ways were drawn to what they call the Israeli model and the idea of reproducing violence against Muslims, for example, in India, in a parallel way to the ways in which the Zionists do so in Palestine, they were very reticent to concede that they were the sort of recipients of someone else's knowledge, and that they were sort of unwilling to play the role simply of the recipient of that knowledge. And they often sort of, in parallel ways, discredited the idea of these Israelis as all-seeing experts and often questioned whether their so-called solutions actually made any sense in places like Mumbai of a radically different scale, radically different magnitude and proportions that the Israelis were surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, quite ill-equipped to deal with. And so, through them sort of reflecting on each other in ways that are less, through the ways that they refer to each other in public, I got the sense that there was a real contestation of the respective authorities of these different actors, and that they were not really seeing eye to eye, despite having a lot in common in terms of anti-Muslim sentiment, racism, bigotry, and so on. So despite those commonalities, they really didn't see eye to eye.
But what did the Indians take from the Israelis? What sort of tactics, what type of machinery? Is it about how they conduct themselves in law and order, so-called law and order, exercises? Is it about something larger when it comes to the military? What exactly were those exchanges?
So there were a lot of specific things. There were like specific weapons, tactics, technologies, and so on. So, for example, quite famous Israeli tech weapons like the corner shot, which some of you may have heard of, which is basically a pistol modification used to shoot around corners, which was developed by an Israeli company. They bought things like that. Things like Celebrate, which is a technology used to crack smartphones. I first encountered that company at an Indian trade show in 2012, and they had this, very innocuous little booth. I believe that has since become, things like Pegasus and so on that are well known in India, as well as, things like anti-crash bowlers to protect luxury hotels, some of which are owned by the Tatas, not incidentally. And so one of the things that the Israelis complained a lot about, though, is that the Indian partners were much more interested in what they called gadgets than consultant. So they wanted to buy these various things to sort of make themselves, to restore their sense of authority and confidence in relation to their own publics and make them look tough. But they were much, much less interested in getting a lesson of how to do police work, for example. And my sense is that the Israelis basically trained a lot of the Mumbai police for free, expecting that they would ultimately get contracts, and those contracts were not forthcoming once the freebies were over. So, they came to teach, Krav Maga and other things, which are of questionable efficacy, among others. I don't think Bruce Lee would be a big fan of Krav Maga, for example. But they were sort of, wined and dined, but also ultimately kind of disparaged. And I think the local authorities, particularly in the state of Maharashtra, got what they needed, i.e. the idea of learning from Israel without capitulating to actually becoming trainees of the Zionist project. But through that piecemeal borrowing of those technologies, which is not insignificant. Pegasus is profoundly damaging to activists everywhere. And some of these other technologies like Celebrate also are are highly worrying, but other technologies like the corner shot, I don't think in any profound way reshaped the anti-terror squad in Maharashtra, for example. So I think it's important to take seriously what has been really profoundly useful for the Indian state, whilst also realizing that a lot of the other stuff, the bells and whistles, the flashy things, the seeing through wall radars, I don't think really changed the game in terms of ordinary police work.
Yeah, let's talk about those fractures. And this is for the activists, right? Israeli arrogance, racism, Indian bureaucracy, and ambition. Are there vulnerabilities in this relationship that activists, for instance, can explore?
I do think so. I think it's a little bit sometimes unclear exactly what can be made of those vulnerabilities, but I think there's a couple things that I would say. I think basically it is important to realize that the ambitions of Indian state actors and particularly Hindutva forces have never been interested in simply being the recipients of Western knowledge, and they have their own project, their own Indian exceptionalism that they wish to exert on the world stage. And throughout the efforts, your book details that in great detail as well. Early Hindutva ideologues and activists were always interested in selectively borrowing from the West in order to serve their own mission. And so I think one vulnerability there is basically that the lines are not just one way. And I think, as you were alluding to, or one of you were alluding to, in terms of the growth of Indian weapons sales in the last 10 years, I think that shows that although the weapons that they are producing are not necessarily considered the top weapons in the world, they do have their sights on becoming major producers of those types of things. And so I think that puts the Israelis to some extent in a position where they, on certain systems, they do have a clear monopoly for conventional weapons, but for smaller items, the Indians, I think, are trying to get a foothold in markets that they see have potential. I also just think that there's, in terms of the ways in which, for example, during 26/11, the Israelis openly sort of disparaged their Indian counterparts. I think that is well recognized by the Indian counterparts. I find it hard to believe that they don't know that, and the people that I spoke to clearly seem to understand that in their own way as well. And so I think it's a very uneven relationship in many ways, both because India in some ways holds the cards to buying a lot of stuff from a much smaller country, which means that they also have a significant amount of power to potentially change the terms of that relationship. That doesn't mean that everything is just going to fall apart, but I think the unevenness is something that is sometimes overlooked.
Have you been surprised by the amount of collaboration, especially since October 7th, where you're seeing drones, co-produced with Israel being sent to Israel? You're seeing an AI, gadget being used by ground forces in Gaza, produced in India. You've also seen other kinds of attempts to send bombs and other kinds of ammunitions. So clearly, the relationship is moving, and it's uneven. But now India is also sending things to Israel. So, what do you make of those developments?
I was really surprised when I started to hear that Indians were manufacturing armaments being sent to carry out the genocide. It wasn't what I expected. I was kind of under the impression that most of the direction of travel was the other way. But I think what it tells us about the genocide itself in broader terms is something very profound, which is that despite the Zionist protest pretense to being self-sufficient, I think the genocide has made abundantly clear how untrue that is now, but has always been. And I think if you go back to the history of Zionism itself, it has been less economic than a lot of people imagine, in the sense that it's been basically a place where the largesse of the US empire and other empires' money has gone, often not in a way that actually is profitable, but it is the way that has facilitated dispossession and colonization, often not because it's necessarily profitable, but because it's possible due to the willingness of partners like the United States to make it possible. And so I guess in the particular context now with India, I don't think it's exactly the same as the US willingness to just basically dump unlimited amounts of bombs. I mean, obviously they're getting paid for those weapons, but I think it does sort of reverse the direction of travel, which is to say that the genocide is possible because it has partners elsewhere willing to send things there as opposed to the other way around. And I think that is the central lesson about what's happening there in Palestine now, is that is what is facilitating it, not Zionist self-sufficiency. So,
have you spoken, again to some of those sources of yours since you first interviewed them?
I kept some contact up until about 2019. The nature of these contacts was such that I never had any desire to continue it to be a working relationship for obvious reasons, I think. And I have no especially large desire to sort of strike up my conversations again with them, though I think if I wanted to, it would probably be possible, but it's hard to tell. I was there the last time in Israel in 2019, and I was told by people that had talked to me freely before that they were no longer willing or able to. So I think under the present conjuncture, things would be more difficult, though the lesson of the book and my own research is basically that persistence does often pay off if you are able to sustain it over a long period of time. So keeping at it and trying to push as hard as you can and not taking no for an answer did get me further than I would have imagined.
Do you get the sense that the Indian public at large, understand that these connections are, playing out, and that these types of relationships are also being built? So, for instance, this Tata bye-bye campaign, for example, did you speak to anyone in terms of the sources that you had in these companies? Did they have any interaction with these Tata workers, or any of the activists spoke about maybe creating a campaign like this? What are your thoughts on that?
So in the course, well, the public's question is one thing. I think it's important to think about it in terms of multiple publics as opposed to the Indian public. I think in upper middle class circles, some of which I had contact with while I was doing my field work, dinner parties and so on in Bombay, people are well aware of these things and they're often very supportive of them. I think in terms of ordinary people who live less glamorous lives, I think their understanding of these things is probably more remote, though I'm not entirely sure about that, I guess. In terms of my own connection with Tata actors it's themselves, I did actually interview a number of them and speak to a number of people who worked for TCS in Delhi when I was there, as well as Mumbai, in part because they were increasingly present at these trade shows that I did participant observation at. The people that I spoke to, I think would have been not particularly suitable comrades to have in terms of organizing. I mean, they were mostly sort of upper middle class technocratic people who themselves were very invested in security projects. But that doesn't exhaust the topic. I guess one thing that I also wanted to mention is that in part because the Taj Hotel was attacked during 26/11, Ratan Tata immediately went to Israel before some of those other linkages with the government took place. And he was very, very enthusiastic about those relations early on. And a lot of his properties, including the Taj Hotel Group, immediately fortified all of their facilities with Israeli bolars and so on. So those corporate connections sort of immediately had returns.
Don't you think that's an understated fact, that the Taj Hotel is owned by the Tatas, it gets attacked, and then, it's sort of like, it's seen as an attack on the elite in Mumbai. And then there's a direct or an immediate sort of connection with Israel as well. And then they come in, and Tata is involved in so many of these Israeli, contracts, military contracts. Surely that's not incidental.
I don't think it's incidental. And it's important to note that in the book, I try to walk a fine line between indulging the ways in which the attacks were represented and, the way in which we understand them to have originated from Pakistan. I think nothing can be totally definitive in terms of where exactly they originated and who exactly carried them out. But as far as I understand, to the extent that we understand their motivations, the growing connection with Israel was explicitly represented as one of the aims that the attacks was responding to. And so I think it's, to your point, the fact that that was explicitly stated in terms of why those elite sites were targeted, and the fact that those same elites immediately went to Israel to protect themselves tells us a lot about the sort of, what I was saying before, is that this is not about public safety. This is
because
really
attacks take place on ordinary people all the time.
Right. And in India, almost unlike other places, for the most part, no one cares. And that is one of the astonishing things about South Asia, is that these things happen all the time, actually. And it's very, very rare that they have the reverberations that 2611 did, in part because their victims are typically not the Tatas. So I think that tells a story about what security is doing, but also the ways in which the linkages with Israel are not servicing ordinary people's well-being, but rather protecting elite sites in the service of their continued existence.
So let's talk a little bit about the process in writing this book. What did it entail in terms of your research? How did you begin the research? Was it difficult to convince your advisors, for instance, on this topic? Because 2025 India-Israel relations is a very different sort of beast as compared to 10 years ago. Of course, it was there, but not necessarily so much in the spotlight. Was that difficult to convince or not?
It was. I'll start with the process. I guess like the motivation of this particular project, which I mentioned before, was started as a PhD project, which in many ways I think I was quite naive and, deluded in my own ways about what I thought might be going on. But the goal of the project really was to kind of get as close as I could to the things that seemed to be happening, and yet no one had really managed to get very close to. And my sense was that getting closer to the machinations of these relationships might tell a slightly different story than the one we were more familiar with, which is partly the one that your book tells, which is kind of the broad ideological contours, the kind of broad political economies of conventional armaments and so on. And that being said, I think one of the stories that I try to tell in the book is that as I got closer to these things, they often disappeared before my eyes. It was often unclear if there was, in fact, a there, or anything at all of any significance had, in fact, happened, or I would simply not able to find the real story. And so it was constantly a moving target where I was dealing with kind of the absence of the more substantial relations that I was anticipating, and yet doing my best to get as close as I possibly could to them. So it was a shifting target. It was a very difficult project to carry out because I was always wondering if I was missing the bigger picture, or if the picture itself was the one that I was seeing as I got closer to it. And so I think, with my own committee members at the time, we wrestled with how to deal with those absences and the twists of the story and the unexpected developments that I think none of us had really anticipated, and how to tell that story not simply as a lack of something, but actually of the story itself.
So one of the twists of the story is also the story of India itself. While you're doing this research, there's the Citizenship Amendment Act that comes into play, and you see, India moving towards becoming a version of Israel, and there's a huge clampdown on students as well at the time. And now you're also seeing that clampdown over here, and in other parts of the world. Are you able to make some type of comparison in terms of how the state here in the US have been clamping down on pro-Palestine protests, especially the student movement, and what happened in India, and if there's any kind of link to, Homeland Security as well?
Yeah, absolutely. As developments have been developing in the US here, as well as where I live in the UK, and the growth of encampments and so on, I've often thought back to one trip that I took to India just as the protests for the Citizenship Amendment Bill were breaking in late 2019 when I was in Delhi, and the massive clampdown that followed that at campuses like Jamia in Delhi and others that were in many ways even more grotesque and violent than the ones we're seeing here now, in the sense that people were being assaulted by cops, people were being incarcerated in profound ways. Not to underplay what's happening here now, but it was very overt and very blunt. And I've often thought back about that as sort of not necessarily entirely a precursor, but it has taken some time for that to become as visible, at least to mass publics here, I guess. I guess I would say I think it's important to note also, here I haven't been to encampments at the US, but I've been to a number in the UK. And when you go to them, I think what's striking is how out of step the clampdown has been in relation to what is actually taking place at the universities themselves. I mean, for the most part, you have a relatively small number of students camped out on a lawn or so on, and the idea that deserves a massive NYPD presence is, of course, laughable. And the effort to try to make that a question of student safety is also laughable, as many here will know. But I think it's also important to note that the threat that those presences, both in India and here, pose are very real, in the sense that, what those students are fighting for now and then was the capacity for, universities to be vibrant spaces of activism, of learning, of radical politics, and that is what they are trying to stamp out. And so, although the threats that they, use to do that are fabricated and questionable, the efforts to reclaim what the university is and turn it something, back to what some of us, I think, might desire is an important thing. And so the university administrators, are right to be concerned, but what they are saying about the students and the threats that they are posing to other students are, of course, completely not what they seem.
So how does this end? When it comes to homeland security in the way the states are using it, to pacify the populations, and you're seeing how, as states become, or many Western states in particular now, well, I don't know what Western means also, but many states that are moving towards becoming extremely authoritarian, moving towards ethno-nationalist politics as well. Where do we go in terms of in terms of homeland security's agenda, and where does it leave activists looking on, trying to decide on standing up to all of these issues that seemingly are all connected, whether it is the climate justice movement, whether it is race, whether it is Palestine, whether it is gender, whatever it is, these issues are all somewhat connected, and yet everything is being sort of like suppressed at this point. So, from your understandings of of the connections or the kind of tactics from these different countries that are using these tactics, where do you think it goes next?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know exactly. I'm not going to sort of speculate on how this all ends. I think what the book reflects on is how these processes are necessarily entangled, in the sense that what's happening in a place like Colombia is necessarily being watched closely and read by other places elsewhere, and what happens at a place like that will inform in some way what is done elsewhere and what they think they can get away with. I think it's also important to just realize, I guess, in the present moment, as people are being attacked and singled out, that the different vulnerabilities of these different people on campuses is worth thinking about, in the sense that some people, like the Jewish students who are coming back to Colombia and training themselves to fence in the last few days, may be in a better position to stand up to the overt repression than some international students or green card holders and so on. And so I think, unfortunately, now people will have to take note of where they stand and what they post and how visible they are in terms of what they can do. And it doesn't, really serve anyone's agenda to have every single vulnerable person deported, even if they may be standing up for what they. So I guess, unfortunately, it also becomes quite technical, in the sense of people having to watch how their, data is being read, or what they post, or what they can say publicly, and so on. I think solidarity obviously is continuing in terms of with people like Mahmoud Khalil and so on. That's profoundly moving. I think in where I work in Glasgow, there has been a return of the encampments just in the last week, and that is really inspiring to see that the spark has not been extinguished. But I was just talking before this event with a friend. I mean, if you think back to the first Trump administration, the capacity and willingness of mass people to stand up and demonstrate now is really under threat. And I think most people feel threatened about their own safety for being present at these mass events in a way that wasn't so much the case in the first administration. So I think we need to think collectively, and we need to think about ways that, respective vulnerabilities can be taken seriously, whilst continuing to have a public presence and not be children.
Well, thank you for that, and I think we'll move on to the Q&A with the audience. So we will have a moderator coming in.
I'll just grab one of your mics. Thank you. You have a question over here?
Hi, thank you so much for this. Oh, sorry, this is louder than I thought it would be. My first question was about whether in your interviews with Maharashtra state police officials versus central government officials, there was something particular about the ETS. Because even given everyone's incredibly abysmal record with anti-terror investigations, the ETS is quite possibly the worst agency we have. Like even the NIA sort of points out how like the ETS is sort of terrible human rights record. And the second question was that particularly after the repression in Delhi post 2019 and post the 2020 anti-Muslim pogrom in February, I saw the Delhi police file a bunch of FIRs randomly alleging conspiracies against the Israeli consulate as a pretext of picking up like university students in Srinagar, and I could never figure out why. And I wanted to ask if in your research you came across sort of a similar move that might have been made by the Delhi police or the central government after 2019 to also, or if there was diplomatic stuff between India and Israel at that point that made them want to involve that in the Citizenship Amendment Act repression, similar to what happened in Maharashtra after 2611.
Just to clarify, your first question was what about the ATS in particular?
Yeah, if there were differences in how Maharashtra engaged with Israel versus the central government, and if there was anything particular about the ATS.
Okay.
Thank you.
So just to be clear, I talked to the Maharashtra ATS. I didn't talk to the Delhi one. So I'm not in a position to comment on the specific differences. Of course, these anti-terror squads in general, as you alluded to, act with enormous levels of impunity and generally exercise discretion and power that is very, very difficult to contest and is generally quite obscure. And your second question, sorry?
Well, just when you were in Delhi, sort of after, whether even outside Maharashtra, it felt like there were entanglements with Israel.
With the consulate or something?
Yeah, that wasn't just the Maharashtra government, but was the central government, or spreading to other states as well.
I'm not sure. I had for a while kind of a Google alert that would alert me to these kinds of news stories, and Azad messaged me in relation to things happening in Haryana. I have only followed those things insofar as there has been reporting on them, in the sense that I haven't been mostly in India, and I simply don't know. These press reports often come up in mainstream English language Indian newspapers, and there's often sort of the announcement of a new particular training connection between one state police force or one municipal police force. In my estimation, from doing that work and following up those things in Maharashtra, those announcements themselves can indicate important linkages, but are often, I would read them more as PR, in the sense that when those things are publicly written about, the purpose is generally in order for those different governmental or police agencies to sort of make themselves look tough or credible or so on. And there's usually, one journalist who's very close to the cops that they give the story to, he gets to write this sort of glowing announcement that everything is going to be different. My guess in most cases is that there are not, the linkages are less substantial than they would imply in the newspapers, but I can't. In one case, I followed up on one of those linkages in Gujarat with an Israeli trainer that was named in that, and he basically told me that there was nothing going on. But again, it's impossible to verify one way or the other. But, yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, can we have hands? Yeah.
Hello, thank you for explaining so much of your work. I'm going to ask a question my question is about the cultural similarities or differences between the people you've spoken to in each of these cases, in Indian and Israeli defense, about how these people see themselves and their country. What is their goal? I'm asking, as someone who is half Indian and half Jewish, and I don't know because I don't speak to people in the roles that you're speaking to. So I'm an insider, but mainly an outsider to the roles in the government that you've been speaking to. So yeah, how do these people see themselves? What are some similarities and differences?
Interesting question. I think the Israelis that I spoke to in these kinds of positions understand their particular role in a kind of settler colonial project, and they see themselves as having particular contributions to making the colonization of Palestine possible, but also in terms of cultivating different solidarities with other similar factions in other places where they understand themselves to have a role or a joint responsibility to, for example, one particular trainer, which is an Israeli Argentinian arms dealer and trainer, had a lot of work in Latin America, in part because of his Latin American roots. And he was, working in places like Mexico on pipelines and so on. And so I think there's cultural affinity with other similar actors in different places. And I think there is sort of a sense that they are doing the same kinds of work, I suppose. The Indian cops that I spoke to were less monolithic, I think. I mean, they were cops, and so I'm generally not particularly partial to their perspectives. But I will say some of them seemed like fairly sensible, reasonable people. In some cases, even Muslims who imagined themselves trying to make their places where they lived and worked better in some ways. I don't agree with their work ideologically, but I think they were a bit more less easy to paint as sort of pure ghouls or pure, there was a sense of, I wouldn't say affinity, but I could kind of relate to their positionality in terms of being in a place where they felt that they had something to do that was sort of productive, even though I don't think that police power really does what it says it does. But
And if folks just want to maybe, that's when it does that, when the mic gets close to the speaker. If folks want to just take a second to share your name, or if you feel open to it, or a little bit about yourself before you speak. No pressure.
Great, thanks. Hi, thank you guys so much for being here and generally for the work that you do in this space. I'm Yashi. I'm currently a law student, and this talk has been super interesting. My question is a little broad, so feel free to do what you can with that. But you've traced, in your answers today, the disparagement of Indians from the Israelis, when you initially started your research, and those behind the scenes conversations that you were privy to. I'm curious about how you see that has evolved over time, because currently, obviously I have not done as much research as you have in this space, but currently as I see it, they have a very, Israel and India have a very tight relationship politically, outwardly facing things look all roses and daisies. So from what how has that evolution taken place behind the scenes, and have you found anything particularly interesting in how things have changed over time?
It's a great question. I guess instead of thinking of the evolution, I think is as an important way to look at it. And I think Azad's book in many ways does a better job than my book in terms of tracing how that evolution has taken place and sort of where it comes from, and the way in which kind of the calculations of Indian state actors in the early post-independence period sort of gravitated to Israel and some of the things that they saw that they thought was worth, having a relationship with. I guess in my book, I guess the way I think about it is less the evolution is real, but I think these things work at different levels and scales. So I think you can look at, for example, the ideological attachment. If you go online since the genocide started, some of the loudest proponents of it are Indian nationals on social media. And that I think that can exist. And there's dual resonance on developments in Kashmir, for example, at the same time. And those things are nurtured by watching the genocide in real time. And I think those affinities have become deepened and entangled. But I think if you look at other levels of interaction, like the ones that my book mostly focused on in terms of, these small arms dealers trying to do work in India, I don't think anything has dramatically shifted as far as I'm aware in terms of the difficulties that were entailed in counterterrorism cooperation. But as Azad was also alluding to, the directions of travel have shifted to some extent in the sense that now Indian actors are sending their wares and their weapons to facilitate the genocide, which does pretend potentially a much deeper investment literally in what's happening there. So I think I guess the way that the book deals with it is to say that there are multiple stories happening simultaneously, and they're not all reducible to one relationship, even though in effect they do add up to a broader kind of geopolitical alliance. Every element is not the same thing. So just another example of that I think is quite striking is a lot of the Israelis that I talked to complain about so-called Indian business culture, and complain about their Indian partners as being slippery and cheap and difficult to deal with. But in other facets, one guy that I talked to, for example, he used to sell anti-crash bollards, and then he got really sick of that and hated that work, and he moved into the diamond trade. And the diamond trade is an area where India and Israel have been trading for a very, very long time. And I got no sense that Indian business culture was a huge impediment to the Israelis buying and selling diamonds. So again, it matters what is being bought and sold. And I think in certain commodities, the fractures and the tensions are very, very apparent, in part because it relates to questions of authority and who's in power. But if you're just selling a commodity, it might be very different. So I think it's just, for me, it was useful to think about different linkages and not reducing them all to one calculus or one logic.
Hi, I'm Sheba. I'm a lawyer. This has been really interesting and depressing all in one go. I'm also really excited to read your book, Rhys, after this. I guess it sounds like you talked a lot about the export of arms and police tactics. I'm curious about the export of laws and the structures that are giving these cops impunity, the ability to shoot at sight, the ability to detain without clear charges. I know the way in which kind of India launched its own Patriot Act post 2611 and the way that America launched its Patriot Act. Obviously, India has the UAPA. I think the Citizenship Amendment Bill leads from Israel's own apartheid views on citizenships. I'm curious about if you can talk about the export of legal ideas that are building up homeland security in India, and if that's coming by way of Israel, or if it's really, the engine is really America and its global war on terror. And obviously we're seeing laws in America resurge in this name of homeland security right now, and what that might mean for the future, going forward.
Yeah, great question. I detail this quite a bit in the book, but I mean, the book is primarily focused on relations between Israeli actors and Indian actors. But after 2611, initially the main contours of debate were emulating the US Homeland Security state. And there was a lot of discussion about, emulating the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, but also other organizations like the FBI and so on. And so I think the book in many ways says, the idea of the Indian supposed equivalence of those institutions being straightforward copies is very, very misleading. They are not the same. They don't have the same resources. They don't operate in the same ways. They don't have all the amenities that the American counterparts or Israeli counterparts have. And, in some crude way, they're probably a bit less dense, possibly less sophisticated, and so on. But I think, nevertheless, as your sort of question in some ways alludes to, things like the National Investigation Agency in India, even though it's not the same as the FBI, has been weaponized with enormous efficiency, actually. And having an agency that has broad national jurisdiction to basically swoop in and arrest anyone anywhere with almost no legal, with very, very few impediments, has been weaponized against activists across India since 2611 with enormous and ongoing efficiency. So I guess what I would say, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand these things probably in nearly as a sophisticated way as you do. But I think, for example, the NIA has increased the conviction rate of activists and so-called terrorists in a dramatic way. And so although they're not exactly equivalent, the inspiration of the impunity that was seen from afar has to some extent manifested, even though it would be a mistake to sort of look at them as exact replicas. And so I think that speaks to kind of the broader argument of the book, which is to say that like policing is never taking place in a national or domestic context, and it's always already being informed and originating through these efforts that borrow and copy and reproduce, albeit in quite dramatically different ways, but not in ways that are any less significant in terms of their capacity to suppress dissent and try to pacify the enemies of the state.
I'd just like to add one or two things, and that is, Rhys's book focuses on Maharashtra, to a large extent. And so India is a huge place, and there are many, many other things happening around states like Punjab, Haryana, even in Assam as well, some of which, borrow from Israel, some of which involves direct training exercises. And then you have the Indian police services, the IPS, that have direct links with Israel as well, and they go to Israel and come back, and they bring back certain kinds of tactics. We spoke about Haryana. The farmers' protest took place last year, I think, and in a remarkable, find. Essentially, what we found was that the Haryana state chief minister had gone to Israel in 2018 during the Great March of Return protests, in which Israel used drones to fire tear gas for the first time. It was never done anywhere else, but it was done in Gaza in 2018. And the Haryana police, as well as the state chief minister, was in Israel at the time and went to the fence and went to watch how these things play out. And then 6 years later, when it's time to use it, they use it on the farmers, right? So what Rhys says about like it's a very strange relationship in many ways, because there are certain things that are kind of like started and then they stop, and sometimes you don't know when they're going to be activated, and sometimes it's a mix and match whereby they take on an idea or they start a partnership and realize this is not going to work, or they start a relationship and it's only for hubris, it's only to make a fuss, it's only for spectacle, and kind of navigating that is a minefield, because you can also see from the way the BJP also operate and the RSS operate on Twitter. These are paid people doing things for them, so you don't even know to what extent people believe those things as well, right? So it's a quagmire, right, to navigate. In terms of the law question, one thing we try to emphasize is that this is not just about India borrowing or taking from Israel. India also has its own history, long history of horrific laws and horrific interventions in places in Kashmir, in the Northeast, whereby there are these laws like the ASPA, right, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, where the army can do whatever they want and not be held accountable for it. Now, this predates, right, any relationship. Then there's also things like the Public Safety Act, where young boys or girls or kids are picked up and held without any kind of charges being held, leveled against them, right? They just hold an administrative, whatever that term is. Then there's also things that are happening. Sorry, I'm taking a little time here, but one thing is also important is that you may have noticed things like the attacks on civil society in India, whereby Amnesty International, many people don't know this, they don't exist in India anymore, right? And this is because they've been pushed out. And in Kashmir, you have civil society that has been criminalized. Now, you may have noticed maybe a year or 2 years ago, the Palestinian civil society that was criminalized and turned into, terrorism charges leveled against them. So these things are being they're moving in different directions, right? Depending on what fits. And the last point I'll make on that is, you may have noticed also with this, with the students that are being picked up and disappeared, this new language of anti-national. Where's that from? These anti-national students. That's also an Indian thing, right? We never heard of that term over here. So these things are being borrowed, but there's hubris, there's truth, and there's lies, and there's like a spectacle, going on. And obviously, you can't summarize it or reduce it to one thing, because each state has its own relationship, and or trying to present themselves as having a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Azad was saying is like, an argument that I've been trying to make both in the book, but also more generally, is like, I think there's a tendency to want to say, Palestine was first, Kashmir was first. That is the origin point for everything. And then it sort of emanates outward. But I think what you were talking about is what I found in my research, which is something quite different, which is that it's everything going everywhere all at the same time. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to trace clear lines. And what Azad was saying, like, you can have something learned and picked up and then put in cold storage. It doesn't appear for years later. And then the research questions becomes, where did it originate? And that's a reasonable question to ask as a researcher or as a journalist or whatever. And we can find some partial answers to those things, but they're never definitive. And they always go much further back than anyone would like to imagine. So I guess, the drone example, I think, is a great example of a very specific thing, a tactic that originates from somewhere and goes elsewhere. But if you think about the idea of dropping tear gas from a drone, it's not particularly profound, or there's nothing that technologically advanced about it. One would imagine it probably would have happened sooner or later, but it did happen in Palestine, and that particular contingency matters, right? So it's an unsatisfying answer, but it's just like, if we're dealing with these things, we have to be dealing with circulations in a lot of different directions all at the same time, which isn't a neat story to tell, but I think is the story that is, like, as close as we could get to capturing what is really happening and how these things are in circulation and how they come in vogue, and how, now in a place like the United States, like, these things that we think never happened in the world has been happening all over the world for a long time, but then now they're becoming visible here in a different way.
Hi, my name is Adib. I work as a designer in tech. Not very exciting, but let's be here. Thank you so much for this talk. Learned a lot, many rabbit holes to go down after this, so that's exciting. I was wondering if through your research, you were able to address how there's a very strong presence of Islamophobia through these inflection points of the concept of homeland security. I think growing up in Mumbai, the 26/11, in addition to it being an attack on the elite, there was a concerted effort to frame it as not just a terror attack, but a Muslim attack. And I'm wondering if there's anything you can share on that, if that came up at all.
Absolutely. So when I was doing the field work for the book, I was in Mumbai when Essa was executed, who was, for those who don't know, the only alleged perpetrator who was captured alive of 26/11. And I just remember looking at the images. There was a lot of like nooses in Indian newspapers at the time, and it was truly grotesque. And I also interviewed one of the cops who I believe supervised the execution in real time. And it was just, the Islamophobia was so visceral and so overt, and like I feel that was like another kind of inflection point in terms of, I guess, I don't know, not the silent part. It has never really been silent, but the capacity to sort of express those things in public. Although 26/11 was not all that it seemed, I think it paved the way for that kind of extremely overt and unabashed Islamophobia to be said publicly in ways that were somewhat departures from prior moments. I guess, yeah, I mean, in terms of Homeland Security itself, I think it's important to locate it fundamentally as a racial project and something which, essentially is about the regulation and racialization of bodies in differential ways. And I think that's not, I mean, a lot of scholars have said similar things, but I think that became especially clear in the book. But it's also, I mean, one sort of story that I tell in the book is like, when I traveled on the rail lines, the suburban rail lines in and out of Mumbai. I was living in Navi Mumbai, which is like an outer suburb. You would see these wanted, back to the anti-terrorism squad, these ATS posters that were posted all along the rail stations, and they were always Muslim youths. There was one in particular that was sort of recurring, and that is not in any way specific to 2611. It's not specific to Homeland Security. It is sort of something that's been recurring for a very long time. So I think the Homeland Security project sort of coalesces that and sort of reinstantiates that and gives it more energy. But the underlying Islamophobia and racism that is part and parcel of that, the ATS has been around for a lot longer than Homeland Security has been a thing in the world. So I think the book tries to sort of navigate both what is sort of meaningfully new or what may be shifted, but also trying to take seriously that much of the architecture and much of the logics and imagery is very old and not a specific contingency of 2611 or Homeland Security. I don't know.
Actually, in his book, you talk about, in your book, you talk about how the police actually go into like Muslim majority areas in Mumbai after, after these attacks, right, in 2008.
Yeah.
So to your point, they basically then start targeting Muslims, and so they take these methods and essentially it's a racialized method. And also to your point, remember India joined the war on terror, post 9/11, and so India and Israel become closer during that moment. And this incident in 2008 basically becomes the kind of the thing that the glue essentially to push down those methodologies, because now you have like the proof, right? And this is all happening under Congress, right? But there's these ideas and these policies that are being pushed after 9/11, and there's some resistance, there's little difficulties, but it feeds into the longer history of anti-Muslim bias in India. But this event takes place against the elite, with these Israelis and international characters involved, and then you basically are able to internationalize the Muslim criminal, basically, right? So Muslim criminal is the Muslim body is it's everywhere. Like we have the same terrorist in India and we have the same terrorist in the Middle East, the same terrorist in the US. And that's basically what happens.
Just one tiny thing that I wanted to add to that. It's not really in the book, but this is work that I will be forthcoming soon. But I've been looking back at a lot of sort of Indian archives of counterinsurgencies and particular figures like KPS Gill, who some of you may know, who's India's most famous cop and sort of counterinsurgent from Punjab, who was responsible, who took credit for crushing the movement for Khalistan, for example. But what's interesting is if you read Indian newspapers just after 9/11, there's an enormous amount of glee among these types who are writing op-eds just after 9/11 that's happened. And their gambit is that finally the United States will realize that they've been right all along and that the Muslim problem was their idea and that the Americans will gravitate to their point of view. And the book starts with KPS Gill appearing on CNN just after 9/11, essentially trying to make the case that it is the Indians, as opposed to other potential actors like the Israelis, who are the ones who are in a particular well suited to know the transnational Islamic threat. And mostly they didn't get that far with that project, but the sense of excitement and possibility that the United States and the world would come to see things their way, you can see very clearly in these archives, both in news media, but also what they're writing in sort of strategic studies journals. So I think, I think they wanted to lay claim and basically take credit for transnational Islamophobia as their idea, basically.
We're going to take just one last question. Y'all been an amazing and engaged audience. Thank you so much. We'll take it right over here. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned the international, but I also think about the fact that Modi, Trump, and Bill Gates share the same political PR firm. And so how important looking, but also, the dynamic you talk about happened under Congress. So how important do you find heads of state in these dynamics? And also how can imagine or associating these movements with heads of state sometimes be overblown?
Good question. I mean, I'm inclined to think that the particular personalities, of course, matter, and yet reducing to dynamics to the contingencies of a particular person ideology or mindset is probably a bit misleading. I mean, I don't know, like thinking about like Perry Anderson's critiques of Nehru as being kind of not very smart. Your book also sort of deals with his positions on Palestine. And I mean, I think one of the things I like most about your book is I think how it dispenses with the idea of the prior substantial solidarity with Palestinians in Palestine and shows that right from the beginning, among most Indian elites post-independence, the question was not so much how can we help Palestinians become free, but rather how can India position itself vis-a-vis other forces in the world, other Muslim countries, other the global, sort of the third world alliance and so on. And so it was I think in your telling much more questions about machinations about which was the most advantageous position to take, as opposed to how to be meaningfully in solidarity with other formerly colonized or currently colonized peoples. I mean, the people that I talked to, some of them, were very partial to the Zionist project more than others. Some of them disparaged it. This is Indian, I don't know what to call them, leaders. I mean, these were like high-level police officers and so on. It mattered to an extent because some of these people took initiatives that probably wouldn't have happened if they were less partial. But in terms of how, the broader contours of how it played out, I guess I can't really say, but I think sometimes under particular conditions, one person's agenda can lead to something. I mean, back to the Tatas, like that particular affinity clearly mattered in terms of which particular technologies the Taj Group bought for their hotels. How far that takes us in terms of national politics or politicians, I guess I don't know. I don't know if we're going to look about in terms of transnational elites or class formations and so on. I think reducing it to personalities is probably maybe not the most helpful. But.
I have to respond to that because this is a pet peeve, right? You notice how some of the politicians in the US also talk about Netanyahu conducting this genocide, right? And so it's all BS. And Modi being the face of it is a way to escape other kinds of accountability for the failure of these liberal projects, essentially. The India-Israel relationship was built up, the infrastructure was built up by the people who preceded him. He's just putting the coating on it, right? But I want to say one more thing about why this book is so important, and I know you've been very generous for telling me that my book is nice, and this was not this was not what you were supposed to do, right? But there's something. I was just googling this, right, and what we don't understand is over the past decade or so, there've been a lot of religious affiliated type of organizations that are doing work like in civil rights and stuff in the US that have been taking Department of Homeland Security grants. And so it's kind of like the self-policing of the community that's taking place, and it's kind of neutered the community. And so a lot of discussions about, how students and Muslim activists, or people who want to talk about resistance, things that push the envelope to some extent, how those things are dismissed as a result of taking those grants and making sure that you don't get into trouble. So you reach this point today in which you don't even have to talk about resistance, and you are already marked for just holding up a flag or whatever it is, writing an op-ed. And so this is why I think the book is so important, because a lot of our communities here, immigrant communities in particular, Muslims in the US, don't understand how evil these organizations are, and continue to move closer to them, thinking that they'll take these grants under the auspices of like protecting your community. But actually you are surveilling your community and you are neutering it. And so I really hope that, if you're able to talk to one person in your family or in your community about like when DHS comes up, like in a couple of years when things change, I don't know what that means. But if that happens, where DHS is seen differently, that you're like, hold on, no, this is what's happened now is a result of what we allowed also to happen. And that's, I learned that, I heard about these grants and this DHS stuff. I never fully understood it until I read your book, to be honest. This the idea that Homeland Security is such a new concept. It's like 20 years old. What are we talking about here, right? It's absurd. So thank you so much for writing this book, for all of your work, all of your nuance on this topic. Thank you to the audience for hanging out for so long. I hope you have a good evening. Thank you to SALAM for hosting this. I really appreciate that you continue to elevate this topic. And please support SALAM with this campaign as well. If SALAM wants to say SALAM as well, then come on.
Salam. Can we have another round of applause for Azad? Yeah, this is such a fundamental book for us on the South Asian left and broadly in solidarity to be thinking about, especially living in the imperial core, right? Like, what are the connections that we can disentangle? So thank you, Rhys, for coming out all the way. Rhys doesn't live in New York. He's here to present this book to us, to provide this knowledge to us. So can we just have another round of applause? Yeah. So my name is Sami. I'm a Salam member. I'm gonna do a South Asian left chant. Tata tata bye bye. Tata tata bye bye. Tata tata hi hi. Thank you all for coming to the event. I know it's not easy, but I want to center us back into Gaza and Palestine. Every day we bear witness to the unconscionable. We bear witness to the violence against the Palestinian people. We bear witness to the silence of our neighbors. Since the violation of the ceasefire by the Zionist entity in March, we have seen 1,309 martyrs in Gaza. We will honor each and every last one. Their memory will not be a statistic. Their memory will be a blessing. We bear witness to the Palestinian sumud, steadfastness. On October 7th, we witnessed the birth of a new world. October 7th, the feat of the Al-Aqsa flood, a year and a half of struggle, a year of fierce resistance by the Palestinian people. That is the ethos that we base ourselves on. More than a year of witnessing from the heart of the empire, of struggling in the streets of New York City, of mobilizing and organizing against the occupier, Israel and the United States alike. As an organization that is rooted in liberation movements of South Asia, we have a particular duty to target another settler going on to tea, which is India, that also is materially furthering the occupation of Palestine. This insidious relationship draws out the parallels between these evil empires, and it gets to the heart of our organization, gets to the heart of our work over the past year and a half. We want to mobilize our community towards targeted action, and we hope to take this campaign and channel our analysis into action. So what is the responsibility here, right? We must move this knowledge into action. We must move this wisdom to action. Comrades, it's as the late Vladimir Lenin asked, what is to be done? We must form a vanguard. This is not theoretical. Comrade Azad and Comrade Rhys have written these books. These aren't just books. This is laying out an infrastructure for us. This is a roadmap to action. It's really a question of infrastructure. We follow the example of the resistance. We follow the example of the Yemeni armed forces and how they destroy the enemy in the Red Sea and how they force the most powerful people in the world to their knees. And of course, we look at our comrades around the city and in the nation. We look at the Palestinian youth movement and their targeting of the bloodthirsty logistics giant Maersk. We look at comrades in the back, BNY funds genocide, Mellon funds genocide organization that seeks to force BNY to divest its holdings from genocide. And of course, Palal Auda and their campaign against Citibank. These are our coalition partners. These are the people that we're thinking with. So I know we're facing state fascism. I know we're facing severe amounts of pushback, families being separated for the crime of standing in solidarity with Palestine. But we can't despair. We cannot retreat. In fact, the scale of our repression, the scale of the pushback we face is a sign of the success of our movement and our ability to cause crisis in the settler colonial empire. Comrades, this is not an academic talk. I know it says book talk up there, but this is not supposed to be a book talk. Rhys's book, Azad's work, Salam's action, this is a roadmap to action. So join us in building the resistance. Join us in honoring our martyrs. There is only one solution.
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 Intifada revolution.
Intifada revolution.
Intifada, intifada.
Intifada, intifada.
Long live the intifada.
Long live the intifada.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sami, for regrounding us and bringing us back to like the entire reason we're here, which is to take action together. And there's just so much more we could talk about like the different focuses y'all's work takes, how it's, you know, getting to see it in conversation with you two in conversation. So thank you so much again. I just want to say, you know, you're welcome to hang out. We have the space for 20 more minutes. So come talk to us. Can all the SALAM members raise your hands? Come talk to us if you want to join, get involved in the campaign, or like Sami said, we also have our comrades from BNY, Mellon Funds Genocide in the back. Woo! Thank you. And yeah, thank you again, guys, for being here. It's done. But yeah, just mingle. Thank you again, and have a great night. We're all here to talk to you about taking further action. Oh, one last thing. Can we go to the last slide, please? For all you special people who came out, we have a discount code. So if you go to sup.org, which is Stanford University Press, and you put in Machold 20, you get 20% off.
Yeah.
Whoa. For sure.
100%. It's also the QR code on the flyer.
We love discounts.
We love discounts.